there is a tremendous amount of hard work ahead of us, and none of it is going to be solved with slogans like defund the police or, we're just not going to have reform at all. We are going to have reform. We're going to have the right kind, and it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of hard work, and we need to buckle up and get ready for it.
My guest tonight is an incredible guy. I'm actually going to be campaigning with him in just a couple of weeks. He is a libertarian international economist, an active duty police officer, and he's also a Libertarian Party candidate for Congress to serve Florida's 20th district. He has been a police officer in Broward County, Florida since 2010 and a registered libertarian since 2011. His prior career in finance and economics included work with banks, the White House Office of Management and Budget, international development agencies, federal agencies, and trade associations. This guy's basically smarter than me, and we're going to find out just how much smarter than me over the next hour. He has traveled in 35 countries. He's taught economics at 3 universities. He holds a BS in aeronautical engineering and an MBA from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. I can't even pronounce where this man has degrees from. And an MS and PhD degrees in economics from George Washington University. This is possibly the smartest human being I've ever had on this show. Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow Americans, please welcome to the show, Mr. Mike ter Maat. Mike, thanks so much for coming on the show, man.
Spike, you make me laugh. As my dad used to say, if you were so smart, you wouldn't need all those fancy degrees. No, I am not smarter than you are. In my mind, I'm a professional libertarian. I am sworn to my duty to protect your rights. And I would go so far as to say most every cop I know feels that way, whether they use the word libertarian or not. But police officers become police officers by and large because they want to help people, and specifically in the realm of protecting people's rights, whether that's keeping people out of harm's way, protecting them from other people who would infringe upon their rights. And of course, being a good cop means learning how to not go too far and to protect people's rights, even from ourselves as police officers. I think the big picture for me, especially as an economist, is that we would prefer that the labor market for police officers were more like labor markets in other industries.
Okay.
In other words, we'd like to see not only on the upside for police officers competition for good officers, but we'd like to see situations in which bad officers are held accountable, for the markets to be such that it weren't so difficult to fire bad officers. In any other industry, someone who doesn't perform very well disappears from the industry, right? Or finds their way down the ladder of opportunity one way or another.
Right.
And it's no secret that public sector unions and unions in general can sometimes, I would say usually, make it very sticky in terms of holding professionals accountable, whether that's, in terms of firing someone or differential pay. Like with teachers, we don't have the flexibility to pay good officers more and bad officers less, right? And a lot of, I think, what police officers negotiate for through their unions is stability. But qualified immunity is going to go away. And that'll leave us in a situation in which we need to either be indemnified in some sense or acquire liability insurance, malpractice insurance, just like any other high liability industry, the leading example being doctors, right? Surgeons, as you brought up. And that's how we would want the market to work. If you're bad at your job, you're going to eventually get priced out because you're not going to be able to afford the insurance. And insurance companies will add a layer of accountability, even where cities and other counties, states, other employers find it difficult to do so because of union contracts. Not so will be the case with insurance companies. They're not going to be held back by BS in a union contract, or else you won't be able to get the insurance in the first place.
Right.
So that's important. And the other element to that is that our elected leaders, our city leaders, county leaders, state leaders need to be much more involved in the contracting process. They need to be bargaining for the things that they need, and frankly, the police officers need to rebuild trust between police departments, between police officers, and the communities that we serve. It's obvious that we've lost a lot of trust in both directions over the last several years. I would argue that we've lost a lot of trust slowly for decades, but recently quickly. We always say no victim, no crime, right? Even if there was a victim and there was a crime, when the victim says, I don't want to press charges, or the victim just won't cooperate, right, and says, I don't want to talk to you, the conversation at that point is kind of over, because if you don't have a victim, you don't have a crime.
Right.
But when it comes to these victimless behaviors, and most of what we're talking about today is drug related, right?
In general, yeah.
And that's at the moment the most important example. You know, we can talk about prostitution, for example, also, and a couple of other things. But the big thing before the public right now is deciding to what extent we want to decriminalize behaviors surrounding drugs.
Right.
When it comes to this, the state still wants people to be prosecuted, even though there isn't an identifiable victim. Right. And so for most police officers, that just naturally rubs you the wrong way a little bit, right? Because you're used to being able to identify a victim. And the other issue that goes hand in hand with that from a police officer's perspective is that we know how many people are affected negatively by a wide variety of drugs, right? Neither you nor I are going to try to convince each other that the United States doesn't have an opiate addiction problem. To see that is to raise your concern. To fight it in a criminal sense and not be able to significantly affect that is frustrating, and naturally eventually leads you to, there must be a better way to fight this, right? And I believe that police officers are likely to always be involved with whatever public response we want to have to drugs, to addiction, to any kind of illness.
Right.
But criminalizing it doesn't, as it turns out, doesn't help. So I think there's a couple of different ways that you can come at this. You can come at this strictly as a libertarian and say, what I do with my body is my business, and you all can go pound sand. I am a big believer in public service. Full out. Public service, in many cases, requires public policy. Public policy requires political principles. So if you're going to believe in public service enough to take a job in it, almost assuredly you're going to end up in a situation in which part of the job runs counter to your political druthers. It's that way whether you're a firefighter or, you know, you're a soldier or you're a sailor or an airman. If you work on budgets for your city, I used to work as an economist for the White House. Did I see things that I hated? Listen, I was there when my boss's 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 boss, George Herbert Walker Bush, went back on his read my lips, no new taxes pledge at Andrews Air Force Base and agreed to what I think everyone was willing to call a tax increase in some sense. A lot of us were upset by that. We were upset because he had said he wouldn't. We were upset because we didn't want new taxes. The basic nexus of the war on poverty is that if you made resources available to people who are in poverty, that would give them a way out of poverty.
Right.
And the other piece of it was what that developed into in counter to that. Talk about the 1980s, talking about the Reagan years. We then began believing that a rising tide would lift all boats, right? And we were very optimistic and naive about that as well. As it turns out that a rising tide does not lift all boats. We see a great deal of mobility in our economy from one strata to another, everywhere except for the bottom. In other words, we see people going from middle class to upper class and upper class to middle class all the time. We see some people escaping poverty every year, but not the kind of mobility that you see in the rest of the economy. The bottom of our economy works differently than the rest of it. And the one thing that I have learned from looking at economic development, both in the United States and elsewhere, and of course, following this as a police officer on road patrol for the past 11 years, truly poverty is a political phenomenon. Poverty not only is, in many cases, caused by bad public policy, but it is locked in to what I would characterize as persistent intergenerational poverty, the kind of poverty that leads from one generation to the next. It's very difficult to escape over a long, long period of time. So if you start out looking at folks in difficult situations, the first thing you notice is that poverty is a geographic concept, right? Poverty is concentrated in certain places, and that leads to crappy public schools and an absence of private schools, and until recently, a complete absence of charter schools, which is a fairly recent phenomenon for which we're all eternally grateful. But because public schools have a virtual monopoly, locally speaking, over the use of public funds, face no competition, it's very difficult for the problems of public schools to be corrected. There's just no economic force driving them to do so.
Right.
And that limits all kinds of opportunity, right? Not only does it limit economic opportunity, it actually limits, in some cultural sense, even aspirations for what most people would consider economic development. Most people that graduate from the worst public schools, including those in Broward County, where they truly are bad, most folks wouldn't even recognize the economic opportunities that are made available to people graduating from private schools and from good public schools elsewhere in the United States. When you combine that with our criminal justice system, which, as you and I were just discussing, criminalizes some very basic victimless adult behaviors, you get people seeking opportunities to make money in street crime. Street crime comes from the combination of bad public schools and prohibition, right? Street crime, lack of economic opportunity, a number of other bad public policies that we have in place. We still at the federal level subsidize the breakup of the nuclear family, unfortunately. We subsidize the concentration of housing at the lower end of the spectrum. We have zoning ordinances that preclude integration of low and high income families. We do all kinds of things to make it difficult. And what we find is that the justice system plays a major role, not just because it sweeps up so many people through the criminalization of things that shouldn't be criminalized, but of course our sentencing is so much heavier than the rest of the world,
right,
that we find other ways to break up families, to undermine economic development, to undermine entire communities. And that leads to tough parenting situations. Tough parenting situations leads to problems in school. And so you see the cycle continue.
Yeah.
And there's the cycle. And I wish that weren't the case, right? I'm not trying to suggest that breaking the cycle is easy. It's not. It's a lot easier to describe than to fight. Plenty of people on the right like to describe this as a fairly simple problem. All you need to do is graduate, get a job, work hard, don't get pregnant until after you're married, and your life is going to be good.
Right.
Yeah, that's easier said than done if you graduate, or more importantly, don't graduate from a bad public school. A lot of people I find down here in District 20 or any of the other number of places where I've either worked or visited in pockets of poverty, a number of people will tell you, well, even if public funds were available to private schools, we still wouldn't have private schools here. We don't have any private schools now, right? So it wouldn't do us any good. Well, the truth of the matter is that private schools, if they know nothing else, they know which side of their bread gets buttered, right? It's no coincidence that the private school that I was able to send my daughter to, notwithstanding the mortgage on the house I had to get to pay for it, was in a wealthy community. It's not a coincidence.
Right.
If you were to make public funds available to private schools in District 20, I can guarantee you the Archdiocese of Miami would take notice. There would be private schools there in due course, and it wouldn't take a generation. The reason that I got into this race in particular is because the issues that matter so much to the residents of District 20 are issues that have been important to me personally and professionally for a long, long time. Police reform and economic development, particularly in terms of defeating poverty, ending the war on poverty, and replacing it with common sense rules and legislation that lets people develop the economy the way it needs to be from the ground up instead of just throwing money at it. I had the opportunity to participate in a forum with the Democratic candidates a couple of nights ago. And I have to admit, notwithstanding having followed some of these people for years and having seen them in the news and online, it is breathtaking to be in a forum with them in real time and hear them talk about the way out of poverty is to go find contracts, go find money, spend more resources on this and that, and these families will somehow magically be able to climb their way out of poverty. It
Right.
does not work like that.
No.
If it
No.
would, we would have solved poverty literally 40 years ago. So we know with certainty it doesn't work. We just have to convince people to take a fresh approach. And I believe that that's the same thing with criminal justice reform. We put into place a crime bill 25 years. I can't believe it's been so long. Democrats and Republicans alike were buying into it. People were optimistic. It didn't work. It turns out that sending people to jail for stupid things for long, long, long periods of time is no way to fight crime. It's just a way to bust up communities. We have to take a fresh approach to so many of these things. And it's absolutely heartbreaking to see the Democratic Party doubling down on the idea of the war on poverty, the same as it ever was, and claiming victimization of one group or another instead of helping people find ways to develop their own economies. And seeing the Republican Party just absolutely stand in the way of criminal justice reform, police reform in particular, and saying no just because they're not interested in the hard work of bringing police officers along as natural allies in the process, which we will be eventually. We just saw in the state of Washington legislation being moved without police officer involvement, and now everyone's all mad at each other because nobody understands what the other side really wants out of it. So politically and in terms of communication, understanding what people need and understanding what voters are ready to hear, there is a tremendous amount of hard work ahead of us. And none of it is going to be solved with slogans like defund the police or, we're just not going to have reform at all. We are going to have reform. We're going to have the right kind, and it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of hard work, and we need to buckle up and get ready for it.